I'm Tim Quilty, the Liberal Democrats member for Northern Victoria in the Victorian Upper House. As many of you know, I've been a vocal critic of the Andrews government's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, their reliance on the emergency powers to use coercion to control us instead of telling us things and trusting us. For the entire COVID period, use of force has been their first rather than their last resort. The vaccine mandates are the latest abuse of that power, but it has been non-stop. 2 weeks to flatten the curve turned into 2 years of a police state. On top of the complete disregard shown towards the Victorian Human Rights Charter, the rolling extensions to the state of emergency have provided very little, if any, accountability by the government for their actions. I was so bothered by the government's actions and their lack of accountability that in July this year, I introduced a private member's bill to amend the state of emergency laws, with the intent to hold the Premier, Ministers and senior bureaucrats responsible for their actions. Had the bill passed, those in charge would have faced hefty fines and potential imprisonment for misusing powers over the Victorian public. However, the bill became stuck in committee, now never to be seen again. So it should come as no surprise to you that my opposition to the new permanent pandemic powers legislation, the Public Health and Wellbeing Pandemic Management Bill, is no different. Last sitting week, the bill sailed through the Legislative Assembly, where the government holds the majority with little debate. This was shocking, but by no means surprising. Next week, the bill will be debated in the Legislative Council. You can be sure that I will speak out against this blatant power grab by a Premier who is taking a blowtorch to the rights and the freedoms of ordinary Victorians. In the last few weeks, my office has been inundated with emails and calls from tens of thousands of concerned citizens. It's clear the bill has many of you worried for the future of life in Victoria. Here are some of the concerns. The bill will give the Premier the power to declare a pandemic, without consulting Parliament, without even needing for there to be a disease in the state or even in Australia. It gives the government a blank cheque to dictate to the people of Victoria. It removes the current approach of relying on advice from public health experts and allows the Premier and Health Minister to operate with executive powers, where they can subjectively interpret the threat of the current or future pandemics. To subjectively interpret means the Premier only has to perceive the threat in order to commence a 3-month order. To be clear, seeking approval of this on a monthly basis, like the state of emergency orders currently, is not a requirement. The new legislation extends the time frame to 3 months before requiring any review. The bill implies that it increases transparency, but in fact, reports will be tabled to the Parliament after decisions are made, and it doesn't stipulate how the information is to be presented. In theory, if the government want to give us simple dot points with very little context, they could. And given that that's exactly what they have been doing with the current state of emergency, it's very likely all they will do going forward. The bill introduces a so-called Independent Pandemic Management Advisory Committee. But the Health Minister will be responsible for appointing members to that committee, and he does not have to listen to them. An additional supposed check and balance is the review of directions by the Scrutiny of Acts and Regulations Committee, also known as SARC. Now, SARC should be independent, and in properly working parliaments it is. But in fact, in the Victorian Parliament, this is just another committee controlled by the government. The same government making the rules will then be responsible for reviewing them. The bill allows for prison sentences of up to 2 years for breaching government directives, which, even in a list of terrible government overreach, stands out as extraordinary abuse of power. It also gives the government the power to discriminate against any class of people for any reason: religion, ethnicity, sexuality, whatever. While I could continue on and on about this appalling piece of legislation, the bottom line is that no government, not now, nor in the future, should ever have access to this kind of power. I would never trust any government with these powers. After the last 2 years, I certainly don't trust the current government with them. I wouldn't trust them with my neighbour's dog. History shows us clearly that power corrupts. And while the current IBAC hearings are showing us that the Andrews government may have been corrupt before seizing the state of emergency powers, this power has certainly gone to their heads. I am well aware of the gravity of the situation, and I know that next week I will be in the Legislative Council voting on a bill that will have lasting effects on all Victorians. We would have liked to have protested the government's exclusion of us from the Parliament for longer, but once they brought this legislation in, it was too important that we be there to vote against it. Unfortunately, it seems likely that the government will have the numbers from the crossbench to pass the bill. If that happens, we must gather ourselves together and prepare to fight this in the future. We will talk about that next step if the bill passes. But for now, the fight is to try to block it in the upper house next week.